Okay, being 2:59 p.m., I'd like to bring this meeting back to order. I'd like to welcome at this time Ms. Angela Vazquez. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here this afternoon. We appreciate your flexibility in rescheduling the interview during these times here. Go ahead and turn the time over to Mr. Dawson for the 5 standard questions, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Vazquez, I'm going to ask you 5 standard questions that the panel has requested each applicant respond to. Are you ready?
Yes.
First question. What skills and attributes should all commissioners possess? What skills or competencies should the commission possess collectively? Of the skills, attributes, and competencies that each commissioner should possess, which do you possess? In summary, how will you contribute to the success of the commission?
Great, thank you. I certainly believe there are some core skills and attributes that the commissioners, each commissioner should possess. I think first and foremost, a strong desire to see an equitable and fair redistricting process. I think that's sort of one of the fundamental attributes for all candidates and for the final commissioners who are chosen. I also believe, a fundamental skill of critical thinking, and I think that can look a variety of ways depending on education and experience, but certainly I think a demonstration of critical thinking and ability to analyze complex problems, and I think thirdly, another core attribute and skill is an engagement style that is open, and I think there are ways to communicate fairly. So certainly communication with the public, should be open and fair. And I think similarly, commissioners in their work together and with staff should be fair and open to dialogue. I certainly think collectively there are some skills that the commission should have, such as ideally we would have folks with different types of expertise, whether it's legal expertise, data analysis expertise. I certainly would hope that we have folks who have done community development, community engagement, community organizing, such as myself. And I also think that, folks who have either some previous governance or leadership or even project management skills or background would be really mission critical for such a large and time sensitive public initiative such as redistricting. For myself, I certainly believe that I have the critical thinking and analysis skills. Part of actually the major part of my roles in public policy and community advocacy has been sort of the ability to identify data sets that are relevant to policy, whether it's educational data, childcare data, etc., distilling that information and then developing policy recommendations based on areas of need, etc. So I certainly believe that I have the data analysis skills necessary. I personally am not a lawyer, but I have worked, most of my roles involve extensive work with folks who are. And so while I don't have that expertise, I definitely feel like I bring to the table the ability to code switch. I think with a sort of legislatively driven process, there's definitely a need for someone with a legal expertise. However, I feel like one of my core skills and one of the best ways I can contribute to the commission and contribute to the community processes informing the commission is being able to take really complex information, distill that, refine it, and then communicate it across the commission when we're sort of doing behind the scenes work. And then conversely, being able to communicate the complicated decisions and all the factors that are going into drawing these maps and communicating those back out to the community.
Thank you. Question 2. Work on the commission requires members of different political backgrounds to work together. Since the 2010 commission was selected and formed, the American political conversation has become increasingly polarized, whether in the press, on social media, and even in our own families. What characteristics do you possess, and what characteristics should your fellow commissioners possess that will protect against hyperpartisanship? What will you do to ensure that the work of the commission is not seen as polarized or hyperpartisan and avoid perceptions of political bias and conflict?
So I think there's sort of 3 core things that I think I possess, and I would hope that if selected, my fellow commissioners would possess. The first, I think, would be a focus and a commitment to the issues. I think certainly in a hyperpartisan climate, folks have developed very strong opinions about, a variety of different things. However, I think a focus on the issues and impact of those issues on communities, whether it be, the local economies, employment, public education, et cetera. I think focusing on the issues and the issue at hand being redistricting and making sure that those political boundaries are fair, I think grounds people in their values. And I think grounding people in their values, many of which we all share at some fundamental level, fairness, self-determination, et cetera, I think sort of helps to diffuse a lot of partisan and highly emotional conversations so that you can, again, talk about things like data, you can talk about things like the impact of, current events on communities and individuals and families, et cetera. I think another important characteristic is really an openness to complexity, right? That people hold varying degrees of views, sometimes even conflicted views. So people themselves, I think, are not monoliths. Certainly, you get 10 Democrats in a room and they're going to give you 10 different opinions on a particular issue, right? And I think as commissioners, knowing that, right, that we will be engaging with different communities who we may think may hold very similar views, but once actually engaging with those communities, we'll very likely see a broad range of opinions, et cetera. So I think definitely an openness to complexity, an openness to conflicting viewpoints, even within individuals or groups of individuals who we would otherwise think are very similar, is going to be something I think that's really important for diffusing, again, conversations that could get very, very high conflict.
Thank you. Question 3. What is the greatest problem the Commission could encounter, and what actions would you take to avoid or respond to this problem?
I think the first one, and probably one that is most top of mind, I would hope for everybody, is really the census and the great, I think, opportunity there is right now for undercounting everybody in the state of California. I think already our state was at great risk of undercounting our most vulnerable residents, immigrants, children, certainly folks who are homeless, folks who are highly mobile, low-income folks. I think those populations who are already really vulnerable and already have been historically marginalized in the political process and in the policymaking process. I think especially now with, shelter-in-place orders sort of indefinitely into the future, I think we're at even greater risk of undercounting those folks. And I think in terms of a strategy to at least mitigate the impact, I certainly don't think the commission itself is going to have much on the front end of preventing an undercounting of the census, but I certainly would hope that the commission could think creatively about how they might engage on sort of the back end after the fact, whether it's community groups, what are data sets that the commission could use or have access to fill in those gaps. I think having commissioners who are mindful that, that there is great risk of the census not being the end all be all data set for which we are drawing maps, that, to the extent legally possible, that we could be creative in pulling other pieces of information to fill in the gaps that the census will leave. I think relatedly, another challenge to the commission is sort of the increasing racial and ethnic segregation across California. That, as our state has gotten more diverse, we have geographically segregated ourselves quite a bit for a variety of reasons, namely economics and historical segregation. And so again, I think as a commission, to the extent possible, being creative about what kinds of information we are able to use, both quantitative data about communities, but also our ability to be flexible with real-time communication, community engagement efforts that aren't just in person, but either driven by, online initiatives, digital initiatives, I think are going to be really important to, again, getting additional pieces of information that otherwise we would not have access to.
Thank you. Question 4. If you are selected, you will be one of 14 members of the commission, which is charged with working together to create maps of the new districts. Please describe a situation where you had to work collaboratively with others on a project to achieve a common goal. Tell us the goal of the project, what your role in the group was, and how the group worked through any conflicts that arose. What lessons would you take from this group experience to the commission if selected?
So as a policy analyst at Advancement Project, I was the lead organizer and really founder of a broad-based coalition of advocates who historically had not really worked together on anything. So a little bit of background, in 2013, the state really radically changed its the way it funds public education. And our organization saw it as an opportunity to ensure that vulnerable populations of students were not left out of that reworking of public education finance. Because I was the resident social worker at Advancement Project, and I had a great boss who allowed me to sort of identify a project and run with it, I saw an opportunity to ensure that LAUSD's 8,000, 9,000 plus foster youth benefited again from this huge statewide policy shift. So I had a passion and an interest, but not a lot of contacts or information about how this policy might impact foster youth. I just knew that I had, again, a drive to make sure that those kids benefited from it. So I was able to sort of go out into my professional networks and identify, legal service organizations, community advocates, youth advocates, foster youth themselves, and I established the Coalition for Educational Equity for Foster Youth. And over about 6 months, I convened them, and we developed really a policy platform that we then took to LAUSD, the second largest school district in the nation. And that policy platform included a request of $10 million in new spending for foster youth. So that would have taken LAUSD's budget for their 9,000 kids from three staff members to about 100. And it was several meetings with Board of Education members that I facilitated, as well as many conversations with existing administrators within the district, again, trying to get as much input to create an actual roadmap for the district of how they would implement our policy platform and fund it, right? So the result of that was over about a year of advocacy and engagement. I was able to help our coalition secure that $10 million. And so it was this huge new model program for foster youth. And it was really informed by my leadership, and as well as my ability to bring together both those advocates who had a huge variety of opinions about what the district should be doing and how they should be doing it, and really build consensus for our group so that we could go with one voice to those policymakers. And I feel like with all of that work on the coalition is very similar to the kinds of community stakeholder engagement that I would do as a commissioner in the redistricting process. And I think the way that I engage those elected officials and policymakers gives me a really important perspective in how community members would be approaching the commission. I certainly was a passionate advocate in board meetings, giving public comment to LAUSD. And certainly I had the backing of a coalition of folks. And I really appreciated the complexities that the board members had in terms of weighing different budget priorities. We were certainly not the only interest group going to the board with our requests and our asks, and I'm grateful that we won. But I certainly was very cognizant that we were one of many voices and organizations and coalitions who were asking for really the same thing. And so certainly that experience is going to be top of mind for me as a commissioner, knowing that there are going to be lots of groups represented arguing passionately, and being able to weigh those voices among the many others that will be present for sure.
Thank you. Question 5. A considerable amount of the Commission's work will involve meeting with people from all over California who come from very different backgrounds and a wide variety of perspectives. If you are selected as a Commissioner, what skills and attributes will make you effective at interacting with people from different backgrounds and who have a variety of perspectives? What experiences have you had that will help you be effective at understanding and appreciating people and communities of different backgrounds and who have a variety of perspectives?
I certainly feel like I have extensive experience sort of navigating productive disagreements and facilitating group decision making, certainly with my work on the coalition, again, working with folks who were very passionate, had their own viewpoints and experiences in child welfare and in the foster care system and in the public education system. So certainly a big part of that coalition work was navigating disagreements in a productive way and building consensus, acknowledging when disagreements were happening, and then facilitating the group to move past that toward a decision point or even a decision to table a conversation for a later date. I think sometimes it's important to know when to let a conversation breathe, and when to give folks space, and when to push people. So that was, I definitely think that's a skill that I have developed, and would certainly bring to the commission experience for sure. In terms of sort of more broad experience, I mean, as at the State School Boards Association, where I currently am now, I am responsible for being a liaison for 31 school districts in the northeastern part of LA County. LA County is huge, and we are incredibly diverse. And each of those 31 school districts represents a very different community from really their neighbor. We have, I work with folks who are in very well-off suburban foothill communities in the San Gabriel Mountains. And then I have working class immigrant communities that I work with, school districts that I work with in the San Gabriel Valley. And my work there is really both identifying their individual interests and hoping and working to ensure that that district has what they need to educate their students well, and also identifying areas of commonality, whether it's common interest or common need, and communicating that back up to my headquarters so that we can develop and refine our own policy and legislative agenda based on what we've identified as areas of common interest. I certainly also feel like, I'm a woman of color. I grew up in the Inland Empire. My parents are both second generation. So I grew up among immigrants, but I do not have an immigrant experience myself, but I'm sensitized to it. And I certainly feel like I think that's an important attribute for hopefully all commissioners to have, is this sensitization to a variety of communities. I don't know that it's possible for every commissioner, including myself, to know everything about every sub-community or have deep expertise on rural communities in Northern California. But I think what I have, and what I would hope other commissioners have, is a mindfulness of what you don't know what you don't know, but you can certainly be sensitized and mindful of what you don't know, and an openness to learning more. And I think because I'm a woman of color, I sort of expect to go in as someone with a different experience than the folks around me, especially in the professional workspace. So I think just my own professional and personal experiences have sensitized me to being among people who are different and developing working collaborative relationships with those folks.
Thank you. We will now go to panel questions. Each of the panel members will have 20 minutes to ask his or her questions, and we'll start with the chair, Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Council. Good afternoon again to you, Ms. Vazquez. Thank you again for being here and speaking with us today. In your application, you use the words leader or leadership in your essays quite a bit, and I got a strong sense from the application and from hearing you talk today that you are a doer, someone that likes to get involved, to jump in and lead the effort to get things done. In fact, you mentioned that you were recruited to the Pacific Oaks College Board of Trustees by a colleague because he was impressed by your ability to lead mission-based work. If you were appointed to the commission, you'd be one of 14 people who may also view themselves as strong leaders as well.
Yes.
How would you work with other commissioners who also viewed themselves in this same capacity?
That is a great question, and I think I go back to the coalition, which is where my colleague Ryan, who recruited me to the Pacific Oaks Board, why he recruited me to the board. I led the Coalition for Educational Equity for Foster Youth, and in that experience, I was certainly working with folks who who had their own egos, who had their own agendas, who had their own missions, who were experts absolutely in their own right, in many ways more so than myself. And part of my work I saw as an organizer and a facilitator was often, sometimes, especially in those conversations, was to step back and let folks have conversations and disagreements. A bit of what I was referring to earlier, of let folks sort of have conversations amongst themselves, and I myself take an observer role. I don't always have to add to or lead, direct a conversation. I think because I balance my sort of doer side with my learner side. I'm a huge nerd, and I think I'm always sort of very dynamically taking a sort of jump in and participate and then step back and see sort of what what happens. I like to think that's actually one of my strengths, is the ability to take the microphone, but then also be able to step back and encourage others to be more proactive in their leadership as well, because I think I certainly, again, do probably rarely ever have, if ever, the monopoly on truth or what is right. So I certainly feel like, especially on a commission of 14 other folks, that if there is space to lead, that I would be confident enough to take that space to lead, and certainly in spaces where it makes more sense for me to observe and listen, and even be challenged by my other commissioners. I certainly hope that I have the strength of character to listen and be open to my other commissioners' experience and leadership, for sure.
What would you envision as your role on the commission if you were to be appointed?
I view it as, in many ways, a thought partner. I view myself as, in relation to the state of California, certainly a leader and a public servant, right? That this is not my commission. These are not my maps. These are the community's maps. This is our state's maps. These are our state's political boundaries. This is that community. That community, hopefully, ideally, will decide who is a part of their community and what those boundaries, again, to the extent legally possible, what those boundaries are. I think in relationship to my other commissioners, I think we are joint stewards of a process, and again, joint stewards and thought partners to each other, and leaders of staff, directors of staff, who will be giving us information for us to make those really important decisions. So yeah, that's how I view broadly my role. I think it sort of depends on what relationship you're talking about.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It wasn't totally clear from your application how many groups or organizations you were currently involved in. Outside of your regular job, you are on the board of trustees at Pacific Oaks College. Is that correct?
Yes, and currently that is my volunteer civic engagement.
So are there any other organizations that you're currently a part of?
Not right now, no.
Okay. How would you balance your role, your regular role in your regular job, and your role on the board of trustees at the college with your service on the redistricting commission?
I certainly would devote. I view the role of the work of the commission to be intense, and for me would be my top priority. I would like to think that my job would allow me to go part-time should I need to devote more time to the commission work, if that was required. I will say that I applied for the commission knowing that luckily I have the financial flexibility to not work a full-time salaried job. And I know that that is not the case for many folks my age. Certainly many folks, within my communities, whether it's in LA County, certainly none of my own family members could afford to even go part-time in their current role. And I view that as a huge privilege for myself, that I can even consider taking on something like this as someone who is not retired, as someone who does not, make certainly enough income to take a year of absence, 2 years of absence without an income. I'm lucky enough that I feel like my life currently allows me to devote as much time as possible to do such an important public service, I feel like. So I definitely plan to commit wholeheartedly to the commission's work.
Okay, thank you. So you currently live in LA County, and you mentioned you were born in the Inland Empire. Outside of those regions, tell us about some experiences you've had in other parts of the state, and what you may have learned from the people in those regions outside your home areas, about their concerns and their perspectives and their needs and their desires that would make you an effective representative for them on this commission.
Certainly. In my work as a children's advocate at several organizations, a lot of my work has required me to be both a local capacity builder and then also a member of various sort of statewide collaboratives or commissions or what have you. And through that work, I have been able to meet a lot of children's advocates, public administrators, not just in Sacramento, but oftentimes, because these are statewide bodies. I've worked with folks from Sonoma County, in the wake of the fires, and learning how they were struggling to serve students, homeless students in those counties. I was on a statewide collaborative for public schools and how we were changing our accountability system. And I actually remember a particular instance in meeting with that group, that folks from way up north in California had taken 2 days to travel down to Sacramento for this meeting because there weren't direct flights to Sacramento. And to me, it was sort of like, oh yes, there are places in California where there's not air access. They didn't walk into LAX, jump on a plane, and get to Sacramento in an hour and a half. That these folks have driven 2 whole days, stayed at a hotel to come to this meeting in Sacramento. And I think there are certainly, I have learned through my work that there are geographic barriers, income barriers for folks who are more remote or more rural in California. And I'm certainly not an expert in those communities or geographies, but I'm sensitive to the fact that they exist. And as a commissioner, we would need to think through really well how we're going to meaningfully engage those kinds of communities. Likewise, there are desert communities, even within LA County, that I would say most of the advocates in LA County do not even bother engaging with sort of the northern rural desert part of our county. But because that's where most of our county places its kids in foster care, for 2 years, I was driving 3.5 hours out to the desert to go work with school district administrators out in the Antelope Valley, because I felt so strongly that because that was where the need was, that was where my work and our organization's work should be. So again, certainly I don't have an expertise on all of the geographies of California, but I think by virtue of my work, I'm sensitive to the fact that there are going to be a lot of access and community engagement barriers for folks across California. And I would hope as a commission we would work to overcome those barriers.
Thank you. Staying on the subject of communities, one of the biggest tasks in front of the commission is to identify communities of interest all across the state. And one thing I noticed in your application is that you have some experience developing community outreach programs. And specifically, you talked about your is it the Painted Brain?
Yes.
Where you did an internship.
Yes.
That experience that you had developing community outreach programs, I'm wondering how you think that could assist your role on the commission in identifying communities of interest throughout the state, keeping in mind that some communities are fairly easy to find, and some are more difficult to locate and are less engaged. And how do you think your experience developing community outreach efforts could assist in identifying communities of interest throughout the state, particularly those that may be more difficult to locate?
For sure. So the Painted Brain was an interesting internship, social work internship. So it was a collaborative of young adults with mental illness of varying severity, but really in many cases, the folks that we ended up working most with were folks who were traditionally disengaged from other sort of peer-led groups. There's even in the mental health community, there's sort of a hierarchy of diagnoses, and those folks with more severe diagnoses often were left out of, youth support groups, peer support groups, et cetera. And so our work at the Painted Brain was to go out and find those folks who would benefit from knowing each other, but who weren't necessarily there right at the table, right? And I think that's indicative of community work generally, right? I was joking with a colleague that the nature of community work is, hosting a public meeting and having the same three people come every time. And when really you want the other 97 people, in a group of 100, you want to know what those 97 other people are saying. And so I think in that sense, as a commission, we would have to be really proactive. I certainly think opening a space and seeing who comes is one important constituency to hear from, and there will certainly be community groups who will be proactive at coming to us as a commission. But I think then again, being mindful that there will be many other voices, again, immigrant communities, rural communities, very low income, unhoused communities whose input we will either need to create a plan to get directly or to develop really good relationships with close representatives who will hopefully be able to facilitate a dialogue with those kinds of communities, or who will be able to help inform us about those communities which are traditionally really hard to engage. Again, those ones that come to mind are immigrants and unhoused folks, but certainly there are others.
Thank you. Madam Secretary, could I get a time check, please?
Yes, we have 5 minutes, 5 seconds remaining.
Thank you. Ms. Vazquez, could you give us an example of a time where you had to make a difficult, impartial decision that involved setting aside your preference or self-interest?
Yes. So with that, I really would go back to the Coalition for Educational Equity for Foster Youth here in LA. I facilitated and led that coalition knowing that I was not the expert, and that I had convened a table of folks who knew so much more about the child welfare system and the foster care system than I ever could. Certainly as at that point, a pretty young professional. That said, by virtue of my role at Advancement Project, I did feel myself, at least compared to the rest of the coalition, I was certainly more aware of and sensitive to both the budget constraints of LA Unified the political dynamics at play. That was my expertise that I was bringing to that coalition. And I certainly in those conversations, in those coalition conversations, as we were trying to develop our policy platform, I was often the lone voice reminding the coalition that we were unlikely to get any new programs, right? That the district had made very clear that they weren't going to invest any new money, that they were just going to do business as usual. And that was really their way of managing advocates like us and our expectations. And I think it didn't take me a long time, but it certainly, I think I realized that was not building consensus with my group. I was sort of the stickler and the negative Nancy in that group. And rather than continue to push that, hey, you guys, we're not going to get anything, but we should really be at the table anyway, I had to set aside what I thought was managing expectations, and again, work toward finding an advocacy platform that excited our coalition. In the end, I'm really glad that I did that and that I let better angels prevail, because we actually did end up getting $10 million in new spending from LAUSD for these students. And I don't know that we would have gotten that had I not just shut up and listened to the passion and the moral suasion of the rest of the group. And so I think that was a really big lesson for me, that again, I'm not going to be the expert, and in a lot of cases, it may be better for me to sit and reflect on the truth that the group is trying to communicate to me.
Okay, thank you. Time check, please.
1 minute, 34 seconds.
Okay, no further questions at this time. I'll go ahead and turn the time over to Ms. Dickinson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Vazquez. Did I say that right?
Vazquez, yeah.
Vazquez, okay, thank you. So Mr. Crow asked a number of my questions, but so the majority of your career, it appears, has been in advocacy, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Given that, what do you see as the commission's role, or what do you see as advocacy, or what role do you think advocacy should have in the commission's work?
Certainly, I see the commission's work as being the recipients of advocacy. In this case, I would be on the other end of the work that I usually do. My work, my professional work, and even my personal work has often been, advocating on behalf of communities to decision makers, to policy makers, even to public administrators in many cases. And so the role of the commission, I would see, are recipients of advocacy as it relates to communities of interest, and where communities believe their boundaries should be drawn, as it should be, right? That we're a representative body, and the reason why California has moved to a citizens redistricting commission is because we feel like citizens and not politicians will be more responsive to community interests as they shift and as they change. Now, that said, I do think because it's a group of 14 people, there's going to be internal advocacy happening that's going to be present in the group dynamic, right? That there are going to be folks who have strongly held values, and I certainly think that's going to be part of the dialogue among the commission. Is, we have this group saying the line should be here, and we have this other group saying the line should be here, and I imagine that even to the extent that commissioners are impartial, they're going to be making decisions based on their values and their experiences. And so I think even, I'd imagine that those conversations will look like advocacy and sort of weighing, each other's comments and perspectives as commissioners. That to me is also advocacy. So I see it sort of the dynamic happening both externally and internally.
Okay. So thinking about what you were just talking about two different groups having, kind of not agreeing on where the line should be, how do you see that type of thing being weighed, and from what is there one thing that should be weighed more than another?
In the abstract, it would be hard. It would certainly be hard to say. I mean, again, there are going to be legal requirements that the commission is going to have to be weighing. There are going to have to be practical considerations to be weighed. And so I certainly would like to think that it would be situation specific. Each of these boundaries are going to be unique. Each of these communities are going to be unique, and there's going to be diversity within these communities. And so again, that's sort of where this ability to be impartial, I think, becomes really, really relevant, to be able to, at least at first pass, weigh competing interests, or potentially competing interests, different interests, similarly, and then through the lens of legal requirements, practical requirements, etc., be able to tease out those potential trade-offs. And I think that's where the work of the 14 commissioners is going to be most important, is being able, as a team, as a group, collectively decide with holding that importance of saying we were thoughtful about the decision we were making in this particular instance, and be able to justify it to the public. I hope that answers your question.
It does, thank you. Give me just a minute.
Yep.
Okay. When you're thinking of communities of interest and what might bind those communities together, what do you think may influence their preference for representation?
I'm so sorry, could you repeat that last part of the question? I think.
What may influence communities' preference for representation, and how could that differ between the regions?
Got it. Great. Thank you. I certainly think, for me, what comes top of mind in terms of what influences preference for representation is many of the demographic differences among people that I think are are pretty salient, whether it's racial and ethnic differences, immigration status, income, profession, education, ability, gender, etc. I think all of those things and more really are going into different communities of interest, right? I think that's also, especially when we're talking about drawing political lines, I certainly think the very salient demographics are going to be important, like race and ethnicity, like income, like immigration status are going to be very important. And I would also hope that the commission, especially as the lines get more granular, try to look for a diversity within communities where it may not be readily apparent, whether it's, like I said, profession or geography, rural, urban, suburban, what have you. Those are important factors that aren't typically thought of. But I think, again, as a commission, would hope that we would have staff and the data to be able to make nuanced decisions about how communities prefer to have their representatives and their lines be drawn.
Thank you. So the way the commission is selected, the first 8 are selected randomly, and then they select the final 6. If you were selected as one of the 6 or one of the 8, what would you be looking for in those final 6?
I certainly would look, it definitely depends on the composition of the 8. I'm thinking political partisan diversity, gender diversity, racial ethnic diversity. I would really hope, again, just considering the own demographics of our state, that we would have someone who has an immigrant experience, if not an immigrant themselves, at least, again, coming from a community where that is really salient for them and top of mind for them in their experience. I'm 3rd generation, so I'm sensitized to it, but it's certainly not something that it's not a community that I would ever feel comfortable speaking on behalf of. So, I would look hopefully for someone to have an immigrant experience. I would like to see some education diversity. I think it's very possible for the commission to be stacked with experts and nerds and, very, very highly accomplished folks, traditionally speaking. And personally, I think folks who have a high school degree have a lot to offer in terms of drawing political boundaries. So I would sort of look for some education or professional experience diversity on the commission. Those are the 2 that are top of mind. So I think there's demographics, certainly. But I also think that there are certain experiences that just by virtue of the commission, we would need to be intentional about making sure that the commission is as representative of our state's diversity and a variety of characteristics.
Thank you. So I want to go back to a little bit talking about when I asked about what role you thought advocacy could play, and you responded that, the commission would be a recipient of that. So you've done that work, that type of work. Something that the last commission noted was that they felt that there were times that certain speakers at public events may not have been a member of the community that they were saying they were representing, but they were actually, advocating for a political position instead. Do you think with your background you would have something additional that could help the commission work through that type of thing?
I certainly think so. I mean, I certainly think that advocates, I certainly think as an advocate myself, I sort of have an intuition about, I don't even know, I wouldn't even call them nefarious actors, but folks who, like you were saying, maybe aren't representing the interests of the community that they're claiming to be a part of or speaking on behalf of. And I think that's sort of where my cognizance of, these are representatives that may or may not have been chosen by community members to speak on their behalf, and being able to take what they're saying as their individual truth, and understanding that may not be everyone's truth in that community. Again, so I'm Mexican American, but I don't speak on behalf of all Mexican Americans, right? And to that extent, I think you're going to always have to weigh the validity and street cred, for lack of a better term. Hopefully you're able to do some, if you're able to do some background research on folks who are speaking and presenting to the commission in a formal capacity. Certainly written public comment, you can search and see if that person really is vetted by the community that they're planning to speak on behalf of. I think that's another strategy, is hopefully on the back end, being able to vet folks who are claiming to speak on behalf of folks.
You have 5 minutes, 14 seconds remaining.
Thank you. So you mentioned that you have, it was in response to question 1, you made the comment that you have the ability to identify data sets that are relevant to policy. How do you think that ability would be helpful to the work of the commission?
Yes, especially, as a children's advocate, many times I did not have the data that I wanted to have, did not exist. And so whether at the state level, usually at the state level. And so I had to get creative about the proxy data sets, or in a lot of cases, qualitative information I had to go out and gather to answer the questions that I had. So, as an example, I had a project related to child care services for kids in foster care. The state does not track that information. The state doesn't know how many kids in foster care are also receiving subsidized child care. And so through both, qualitative engagement with experts, child care administrators, foster parents, I got a general sense of where that data might exist at the local level. And then I had to go on the back end, really do some direct surveys of foster parents in LA County to get at least a somewhat representative sample about how many young kids in foster care might be in preschool or childcare. So in some ways that might be a product of being nonprofit staff, is that many times there will be huge data sets that you can download and play with and do statistical analysis on. But a lot of times the questions you want answered aren't going to have cut and dry data answers to them. And so as a commissioner, I would like to think that I would help steer the group into thinking creatively about proxy data sets or proxy information sets, qualitative information that we could use to answer questions we had about where communities of interest are.
Thank you. So at this moment, I don't have any additional questions, so I yield my time.
Thank you, Ms. Dickinson. Mr. Belknap, the time is yours.
All right, good afternoon. So you graduated with a bachelor's from Claremont and went on to USC to get a master's degree in social work. When did you know that you wanted to study social work and why?
Ooh, that's a fun question. So I went to Claremont McKenna. I actually transferred my freshman year to Claremont McKenna after 1 year at the University of La Verne. My parents are both public school teachers. They're first generation college graduates. All they knew in terms of advising me about my career was, you're smart, so you should either be a doctor or a lawyer. I had no interest in being a doctor or a lawyer. I knew I wanted to do public service. I knew that I didn't want to teach. And so I spent most of my college years sort of floating and wandering. Part of why I ended up at Claremont McKenna was that I knew that was where you wanted to go if you wanted to do work in government. And I said, okay. I went there, realized that, the ethos there was much more conservative than what resonated with me. And so I hid out in the psychology department and got a lot of really great data skills, but not really sure what I wanted to do with those data skills. And so going to social work school was really my way of sort of splitting the difference. Do I want to do clinical work and work directly one-on-one with children or families or individuals and serve that way? Or do I want to do community work, organizing, policy, advocacy, and social work as a discipline? And why I love it so much is really grounded in both individual clinical direct practice work and that community organizing, public policy work that also drew me very passionately. And so going to social work school really solidified for me that my career was going to be both informed by really others' direct clinical practice, but that I saw my role as a systems social worker being in advocacy and community organizing and development, but always being informed by direct individual experiences.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm curious about the $10 million in funding that you secured in the LAUSD budget. What specifically does the funding do for foster youth?
So it was dedicated to hiring 100 school-based social workers for those foster youth students. So I think I mentioned historically LAUSD had 3 dedicated central administrators to serve 9,000 plus kids across all of their school sites. And so we as a coalition identified a broad need of capacity. We just need boots on the ground. We need people. Foster youth students need people they can go to interact with directly to be able to get their individual education needs met. They needed an advocate on the ground. They needed an ally. They needed sort of a case manager, someone to help navigate especially high school students. I always saw, I think there was a lot of disagreement in that coalition as to whether school-based social workers were the best use of that $10 million. And there was a lot of debate within our coalition about what that $10 million should be used for. I personally, as an advocate and a public policy person, saw that as the district's scaffolding, that was a commitment, that was a stake in the ground, that the board said, we care about our foster youth so much that we are going to make a line item in the budget for these kids, and that our job as advocates was to help shape what that looked like. So, certainly I think it was a new program. It actually ended up being absorbed by a bigger program just last year. But I think that $10 million was certainly a huge win, no matter what it looked like, because it signaled from the second largest school district in the nation that they really cared about one of our most vulnerable student populations. And I was really proud to help shape what that looked like.
So where do you feel your passion for foster youth comes from?
My first year in social work school, I was placed as a case manager at a group home in South LA. It was a group home for young women ages 12 to 17. It was a group home, was basically the last stop before these young women either went to juvenile halls or went into locked mental health facilities. So these were young women with really, really challenging individual needs. And I loved working with those young women, and I hated the context in which I was working. Not necessarily even the group home, but just the administration of the foster care system and how much I had to fight with a system I couldn't even wrap my arms around as a young professional, right, as a graduate student. And that really, for me, put a fire in my belly for systems work and for systems work broadly defined. I think a lot of the great work that I did in many roles was not just the $10 million for foster youth from LAUSD, but a lot of administrative changes I actually helped make at a school site level, whether it was out in the Antelope Valley, helping to put in a process of an education evaluation for every single elementary student at Palmdale School District, so that those foster youth had an administrator look at their whole record and assess their needs. So again, I think that experience at the group home helped me see that systems change with an equity lens can look a lot of different ways, but that someone needed to do it, and someone with a passion needed to do it, and find others who wanted to do that with them. So that's where that comes from.
Okay, thank you. In response to a question that you answered from Ms. Dickinson, you talked about external advocacy and internal advocacy, and you thought that on the commission there'll be strongly held values and preferences. So there'll be some level of internal advocacy on the commission. Mm-hmm. What or for whom do you think you'll be advocating for in terms of internal advocacy if you are selected to be a commissioner?
I would think fairness and equity. I think that's going to look different ways to different people on the commission. And ultimately for me, I would say probably the most relevant value that would inform those conversations with my commissioners are that people are the experts in their own experiences. And that we are being asked to weigh other folks, individuals and communities' deeply held truths. We are going to have to make really tough decisions because these are ultimately in the end, we're going to be drawing bright lines. This person lives here, and so they are part of this community as it relates to political representation. This person across the street belongs in this community of interest. So we are going to have to be drawing bright lines. And so to that end, I think the advocacy in the commission is going to be informed, hopefully not necessarily by our own individual experiences, but the truths and the experiences that we have done a good faith effort in getting from those communities and from those individuals.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So you indicated in your application that as a field organizer for the California School Boards Association, you've had to work with school board members whose politics and personal beliefs are different from your own. Can you provide us an example of an experience where you had a board member whose politics and personal beliefs were different and you had to set those aside?
Yes. So I very much, a big part of my role at the School Boards Association is customer service. And I, especially in the foothills of the San Gabriel Valley, I work with predominantly, upper middle class, white suburban communities, Republicans, many of them, if not most of them. They're elected officials too. They certainly have more power and influence over their communities and even within my organization than I do. And it's in many, if not all cases in my professional role, it's not my role to be an advocate for my own political personal beliefs. I don't, I'm not a Republican, but I certainly have many a lunch meeting with folks who have very, very different political views. And I think for me, a skill set I have is to professionally engage in my role as a public affairs rep with those folks, even though I personally may disagree with their politics, and even if they bring those politics into that conversation, I use my skills to really either try to find some areas of common interest. Usually it's kids and schools and what kids in those schools in their schools need from CSBA, from the state, maybe even from community partners. And I also like to think there are many times where I have been unexpectedly challenged and then sort of had my, because of the relationship and because I still, I think, have mutual respect for the people I work with, that there have been times where I feel like I have had very wonderful political conversations, dialogues with folks, those folks, even in my role at CSBA, that have led to, partnerships, whether hosting a community forum, etc. So I would think on a daily basis, set aside my own politics so that I can listen more deeply for a need or for a concern, which is often where a lot of that comes from.
All right, thank you. A brief question. Do you speak Spanish? And if so, how fluent?
I do not.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Well, I got one last question. This will be longer.
All right.
Madam Secretary, can I get a time check?
Yes, we have 6 minutes, 44 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So you indicate in your application that you have demonstrated in your career the ability to analyze complex data, both quantitative and qualitative. I'd like you to walk us through an example of an analysis that you've performed or been heavily involved in.
Yes. So I'll go back to the child care example. So we had a hypothesis as an organization. I had a hypothesis as an analyst that kids in foster care, young kids in foster care, were not accessing child care and development services the way they were entitled to at a high enough rate. The state does not track that specific data point, how many kids in foster care are accessing. They do have who is accessing child care and development services. So that was a huge data set that I was able to download, the who, the general location, zip code, and they were able to identify basically a proxy flag that was a proxy for child is receiving community services, I will say. So again, it wasn't whether or not they were in foster care, but it was a close enough proxy. We mapped that out. We were particularly interested in LA County, so we zoomed in on LA County, and then we mapped out where those who we termed at that point, very vulnerable kids were across the county. And we noticed some hot spots, and we noticed we noticed that those hot spots were pretty well directly aligned with a lack of childcare services map that we had already created as an organization. So basically, we were able to overlay these two sets of data, right? That we have very low income folks. Second layer, we have a lack of access to childcare generally. And then we layered over this sort of proxy data set of kids who were receiving social services. And we found that there were specific geographies within LA County that were likely to have high numbers of very young kids in foster care without access to childcare and development and preschool programs. So again, not perfect data sets, but by drawing from different pieces of information, we were able to create a map that said, okay, this sort of answers our question, or at least points us in the right direction. And from there, I went and tried to put more meat on those bones by engaging childcare administrators, foster care administrators, et cetera, to create a better picture of what the community being young kids in foster care potentially needed in our county.
Okay, thank you. If I smiled, it was because we had the first appearance of a pet come in behind you. I know you couldn't see it, but your cat walked through. So that's where that smile came from. It wasn't the data analysis.
Got it. Okay.
But anyways, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Belknap. First appearance of a feline photobomb in applicant review panel history. Mr. Dawson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just note that was not the first, that about 20 minutes ago, the cat first made an appearance.
Oh, goodness.
I wanted to follow up on something that you had said in your response to standard question 1. You used an interesting term where you said that you had the ability to code switch between, let me make sure I get it right, the language of policy and advocacy and that of the community. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes. I think code switching, I think, is a term used more when we're talking about language or, but I see it as a skill in terms of being able to interpret legalese. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I work with a lot of lawyers. So oftentimes I'm having to, remind folks, people don't know what this legal term means. So, we need to translate it, not just for us as sort of thought partners, colleagues in the field, but then if we're going to go out and do community engagement around this issue, we're going to have to make sure that we're using plain language and not lawyer speak. And then vice versa, right? That having, communities are going to be, individuals are going to be communicating in different ways, and being able to hear community input that I think that is maybe potentially really emotional and not super specific, but be able to, my ability to be able to hear what the underlying concern is. Maybe that's also a bit of like my social work clinical experience, right? That hear the emotion and then be able to listen for the subtext underneath and communicate that amongst the commissioners. So yeah, that's sort of how I view code switching.
All right, thank you. I wanted to ask you about in the blurb that you put for your work at the National Center on Youth Law, you said that you directed and led the review and analysis of existing and proposed federal, state, local regulations, laws, or policies affecting the education of foster youth in LA County and statewide. My question is, who was the audience, who was the clientele for this review and analysis?
The review were school district administrators and school board policymakers. So, especially the foster care system is a very legally driven system. So is the education system in California. And so when you're working with and on behalf of a student group very heavily impacted by those two big public systems, we're working with policies, you've seen the ed code, it's like, yeah, right, it's really big. So oftentimes my organization and me specifically were called in to present really complex legal issues in a way that made sense to the actors in those different systems. So again, that's a bit where code switching came in, that I was often explaining ed code to foster care administrators and vice versa, explaining, child welfare processes and WIC codes to education administrators.
Okay, thank you. And then that sort of leads to my question about your work at the School Boards Association, where you say that you identified and developed various projects, initiatives, and local campaigns to strengthen support of public education by stakeholders, including elected officials, parents, school staff, and students. My question is, these stakeholders that you identify as elected officials, did that include the members of the California legislature?
It does, though at CSBA, very indirectly. I would say more so at Advancement Project as an analyst and at the National Center for Youth Law, I was much more in conversation with legislative staff and legislators themselves, although at CSBA, I did convene and facilitate a student mental health policy roundtable with Assemblymember Chris Holden. So I certainly have experience working with elected officials and their staff for sure.
Were you ever called to testify on a bill in Sacramento?
I was not, though I will say a very close proxy is giving public comment at a LA Unified School Board meeting, which are often more attended than than the legislative hearings.
I believe it.
Yeah.
I think those were all my questions. Mr. Chair, I have no more follow-ups.
Ms. Dickinson, do you have any follow-up questions?
I do not have any further questions.
Mr. Belknap?
I do not.
I might have one. Madam Secretary, how much time do we have?
We have 7 minutes, 24 seconds.
Okay, so really quick, Ms. Vazquez, if you were to be appointed to the commission, which aspects of that role do you think you might enjoy the most, and which aspects of that role do you think you might struggle with a little bit?
I think I hinted at this earlier, that I really do enjoy group analysis. I like being able to take what in this case will be, staff recommendations, data sets that have been distilled, and reports that are being presented, maps that are being presented. I really like having things to react to, and I love having thought partners who are bringing different perspectives, seeing things that I may not see, bringing lenses that I might not have. I really do enjoy those discussions. So I'm really excited about sort of digging in with commissioner colleagues. I think that comes from my coalition work, right, and doing much of my work in partnership with other organizations. The part that I would probably struggle most with is, again, I am not a lawyer, and so I'm an advocate, and I think I think I would struggle most with not even struggle, but just sort of like the guardrails, the legislative guardrails, I think I would be the one to say, well, what can we do? It says we can't do this. What can we do, right? That I will be the one pushing, and I'm sure that will irritate the resident lawyer or lawyers on the commission. Sorry, counsel.
Thank you for that. No further questions, counsel.
Madam Secretary, how much time we have left?
5 minutes, 8 seconds.
Thank you. Ms. Vazquez, with the time remaining, we'd like to offer you the opportunity to make a closing statement to the panel if you wish.
Sure. So first of all, thank you all for your time and for your commitment to creating a commission that is going to be doing some of the most important policy and political work for this state, especially as we've talked about in this interview, in times that are hyper-partisan, and now with the global crisis, not just the global health crisis, but the global economic crisis. I think we have yet to see just how intense our political conversation can be, and I think the work of redrawing our voting districts is going to be ever more important. As I said before, I truly believe that people are the experts in their own experiences, and by extension, I really am so proud of the state of California for giving citizens the ability through representatives to draw their own boundaries, that this is a public input process. And I would be incredibly honored to serve all folks in the state of California as a commissioner if I am chosen. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Vazquez, for taking the time to interview with us this afternoon. Our next interview isn't scheduled till 9 a.m. on Monday, April 6th, so we will be in recess until 8:59 a.m. on Monday, April 6th.